Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so let the sound of the rain carry you. Before you drift off, get comfortable, relax, and let us travel back to a time of dust and silence. Tonight, we look past the headlines and the Hollywood glamour. We look at the dust, the miles of empty highway, and the quiet moments that defined two lives before they became legends. It was a world where the horizon was always gray, and the concept of tomorrow felt like a luxury few could afford. In the West Dallas of 1930, the air was thick with grit, and the heat was a physical weight that settled on your shoulders the moment you stepped onto the porch. They called this place the Devil's Back Porch, a name that hinted at the misery, but failed to capture the quiet resignation of the people who lived there. It was a landscape of makeshift campgrounds, where families lived in tents or shacks made of scrap wood and flattened tin cans. The smell of the nearby bog hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and stale coffee. When the sun beat down on the corrugated metal roofs, the tin would expand and groan, a metallic sigh that echoed through the afternoons. Unemployed men sat on overturned crates, staring out at the dirt roads, their hands idle, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The poverty here was not a sudden tragedy. It was a slow, quiet state of being, as constant as the dust that coated every surface. They were two ships drifting in a dried-out sea, finding an anchor in one another. It was January of 1930 when Clyde Barrow first met Bonnie Parker. Clyde was a young man, already marked by the law, but in the quiet of a friend's kitchen, he was just a boy with a soft voice. He didn't look like a criminal. He had dark, heavy eyes that seemed to hold a deep well of sadness rather than malice. Bonnie was there too, a woman looking for a way out of the gray, her small frame housing a spirit that felt too large for the campground. The meeting was not explosive. It was domestic. It happened in a small, clapboard house where the wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing the rough wood beneath. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that cut through the window, illuminating a simple scene. Clyde's arm was broken at the time, healing from a previous injury, and he held it carefully against his side. They didn't speak of banks or robberies. They spoke of the mundane. Bonnie made hot chocolate in the small kitchen. The sound of the spoon stirring against the ceramic mug was loud in the quiet room. The floorboards creaked as she moved, a comforting rhythmic sound of a house that had settled into the earth. They drank the warm liquid and talked about their families, about the music they liked, about the dreams that felt impossible in the harsh light of day. There was an intimacy in their voices, a softness that the world would soon try to strip away. They had no premonition of the violence to come, only the shared warmth of the kitchen and the feeling that finally someone else understood the desire to be somewhere else. But the quiet of that meeting was fragile, and the law has a long memory. Something inside him calcified under the Texas sun, turning from soft clay into brittle stone. Not long after they met, the law caught up with Clyde. The charge was auto theft, a common enough crime for a young man with no money and a desire for motion. But the punishment was a descent into a world designed to break the spirit. He was sent to Eastham Prison Farm, a place that sat heavy on the Texas plains, isolated and unforgiving. This was the pivotal moment. the shift that would define everything that followed. Eastham was not just a prison. It was a labor camp where men were worked until they collapsed. The sun beat down on the fields with a cruelty that felt personal. Day after day, the men swung their hoes into the hard earth, the metal striking the dirt with a dull thud that marked the passing of time. The humidity was a blanket that suffocated the lungs, and the buzzing of cicadas was a constant, maddening soundtrack to their exhaustion. Clyde entered Eastham as a thief, a young man who had made mistakes. He would leave as something else. The brutality of the guards and the desperate violence of the inmates eroded the boy who had sat at that kitchen drinking hot chocolate. There was an incident, a moment that history records with a clinical detachment. An inmate, a man who had reportedly abused Clyde for months, was found dead. A life ended in the shadows of the dormitory, away from the guards' eyes. There were no screams recorded, no great struggle noted in the logs. Just the silence of a problem resolved with finality. Clyde had crossed a line in the dark. He had learned that in the world of Eastham, survival meant striking first. When the gates opened in February 1932, he walked out, but he did not walk out whole. The road became their home, a moving strip of asphalt that promised freedom as long as the wheels kept turning. Clyde returned to Bonnie immediately. There was no question of going separate ways. The time apart had only solidified the bond, turning a spark into a necessity. They decided, without needing to say the words, that they would face the gray world together. And then there was the car. To understand their life, one must understand the machine that carried them. The Ford V8 was not just a vehicle. It was their third companion. It was a marvel of engineering for its time, a steel beast that could outrun almost anything the police could throw at it. The interior smelled of leather and stale tobacco, a scent that would become the perfume of their existence. The engine had a specific hum, a low vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into their bones, a constant reminder that they were moving, that they were alive. The spree that began in 1932 is often remembered for the crimes, but the reality of their lives was mostly driving. Endless hours of driving across state lines, navigating by the stars and the faded signs on country roads. At night, in 1932, the world was incredibly dark. There were no streetlights on the rural highways between Texas and Missouri. The headlights of the V8 cut 2 cones of light through the absolute blackness, revealing only the next 100 feet of gravel and scrub brush. The sound of the tires crunching on the road was hypnotic. They drove until their eyes burned, sleeping in the car in shifts, their bodies cramping in the confined space. They were moving fast, but the world was watching. The camera captured a smile, but it missed the exhaustion that lived behind the eyes. By 1933, the Barrow Gang had formed, a small, desperate group of people trying to outrun their own shadows. They found a brief respite in Joplin, Missouri, renting a garage apartment in a quiet neighborhood. For a few days, they played at being normal. They bought groceries, they played cards, they took photographs. But normalcy was a costume that didn't fit. The neighbors grew suspicious of the cars coming and going at odd hours, of the newspapers covering the windows. The police raided the apartment, and in the chaos of the escape, the gang left their possessions behind. Among the items was a camera and several rolls of undeveloped film, When the police developed the film, the images slowly appeared on the paper in the darkroom, ghosts materializing from the chemical bath. There was Bonnie, posing with a cigar in her mouth, a pistol in her hand, feigning a toughness she didn't truly possess. There was Clyde, holding Bonnie up in his arms. The newspapers printed the photos, and the public went wild. In the midst of the Great Depression, when people were starving and hopeless, these images looked like freedom. They looked like glamour. The public saw romance. They didn't see the reality. They didn't see the nights spent shivering in wet clothes, the meals of cold beans eaten out of cans, the constant gnawing fear of every passing car. The media created a legend of silk and steel, while the real Bonnie and Clyde were bathing in muddy creeks and bandaging each other's wounds. While the public gazed at the photos, a shadow began to lengthen across the map. He was a man who understood the language of patience, a hunter who knew that the prey always returns to the water. In early 1934, the state of Texas and the prison system grew tired of the chase. They called in a man from a different era, a former Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer. Hamer was not the loud, gun-toting cowboy of the movies. He was a quiet man, a tracker who moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a predator. Hamer didn't chase them. He studied them. He sat in offices filled with smoke, poring over maps of the Midwest, tracing the erratic lines of their travel. He understood that criminals, like animals, are creatures of habit. He knew they moved in circles. He knew they visited family. He knew that their world was shrinking, that they were running out of roads. The hunt was a slow tightening of a net. Hamer spent weeks living out of his own car, talking to gas station attendants, to family members, to anyone who had seen the V8 pass through. He learned their patterns. He learned that they favored the back roads, the hidden paths between the pines. The atmosphere around Bonnie and Clyde began to change. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a trap. They could feel the eyes on them, even when the road was empty. The circle was closing, and the road was running out. Trust is a fragile currency on the run, and the exchange rate had finally collapsed. By the spring of 1934, the gang was fracturing. The pressure was too great. One of their associates, a young man named Henry Methvin, became the weak link in the chain. Hamer and his men knew that Methvin was with them, and they knew where Methvin's family lived. The setup took place in the deep, piney woods of Louisiana, in Bienville Parish. It was a place where the trees grew tall and thick, blocking out the sun, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Hamer made a deal with Methvin's father. It was a transaction born of desperation, a father trying to save his son from the electric chair. It wasn't malice that drove the betrayal. It was survival. The location was Ivy Bend, a quiet stretch of road isolated from the rest of the world. The Spanish moss hung from the branches like gray ghosts, swaying in the humid breeze. The swampy air clung to the skin, a physical reminder of the trap that had been laid. Methvin's father agreed to park his truck on the side of the road, a signal to the gang. He would be the bait. The psychological weight of this betrayal was immense, a silent tragedy playing out amongst the trees. The stage was set. Now there was only the waiting. The world held its breath. The only sound, the rustling of leaves and the distant rhythmic hum of an approaching V8. It was the morning of May 23rd, 1934. Hamer and his posse of officers arrived in the darkness, long before the sun had risen. They positioned themselves in the brush alongside the road, lying flat in the dirt and the damp leaves. And then they waited. They waited for hours. The physical sensation of the wait was grueling. The ground was hard and cold. Insects crawled over their hands and faces, the mosquitoes whining in their ears. But they dared not move to swat them away. Muscles cramped and limbs went numb. They watched the sky shift from the deep indigo of night to a pale, washed-out gray, and then to the soft orange of dawn. The focus of this moment is the silence of nature before the violence. As the sun crested the horizon, the birds began to sing, unaware of the men hiding in the bushes. The wind rustled through the pine needles, a soft, whispering sound that masked the breathing of the officers. It was a beautiful morning in Louisiana. The light filtered through the canopy and dappled patches on the dusty road. It was peaceful. It was the kind of morning that makes you glad to be alive. And in that stillness, time seemed to stretch, minutes elongating into hours, until the silence was broken by the sound they had been waiting for. The distinct, throaty purr of a Ford V8 engine. Then, the car appeared on the crest of the hill. In an instant, the 2 years of running, of fear, and of noise resolved into absolute silence. The car came down the road, moving at a high speed, dust billowing behind it. Clyde was driving in his socks, comfortable in the machine that was his home. Bonnie was beside him, eating a sandwich. They saw the truck parked on the side of the road, Methvin's father's truck. Clyde slowed down. It was a gesture of recognition, perhaps of concern. He shifted gears, the engine quieting as the car rolled to a near stop. He looked out the window. There was a moment of recognition, a split second where the trap was revealed, but it was too late to turn the wheel. The event that followed was not a battle. It was a sudden storm. The officers opened fire without warning. The sound was deafening, a wall of noise that shattered the peace of the morning. Glass exploded outward, sparkling in the morning light. Metal twisted and tore. The motion of the car ceased abruptly, the vehicle lurching into the ditch and coming to rest against the embankment. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The smoke from the rifles drifted lazily in the humid air, mixing with the steam rising from the radiator. The birds had stopped singing. The wind seemed to hold its breath. There was a profound stillness that settled over the car. The dust slowly drifted back down to the road, coating the scene in a fine gray powder. They became characters in a book, figures on a screen, but in the quiet of the pine woods, they were simply gone. The crowds gathered later, of course. The news spread like wildfire, and soon people were swarming the scene, trying to take pieces of the car, pieces of their clothes, desperate to touch the legend. The Bonnie and Clyde of the newspapers took over, erasing the 2 young people who had died in the car. Decades later, movies would be made. Actors would wear berets and fedoras, and audiences would cheer for the romance of the outlaw life. But the truth was far quieter and far sadder. When the police inventoried the car, they didn't just find guns. They found a saxophone Clyde had carried with him, dreaming of music he would never play. They found half-eaten food. They found clothes that needed washing. These were the items of a domestic life lived on the run, They were just two young people from Texas who got lost in the gray and couldn't find their way back. The legend is loud, full of gunfire and headlines. But the reality is the silence of that car sitting in the ditch, the steam dissipating into the trees, and the tragic waste of two lives that ended before they ever really began. The road in Bienville Parish is quiet tonight. The dust has settled. The history is written. The crowds are gone, and the trees stand watch over the empty highway, as they have for 100 years. The V8 is gone, the noise is gone, and the fear is gone. And you are safe. You are far away from the dust of the 1930s, far away from the desperation of the Depression. You are in a warm place, a safe place. The story is over. The loop is closed. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to run from. Let the silence of the road carry you into the dark. Let the image of the pine trees fading into the twilight be the last thing you see in your mind's eye. The world is turning slowly, and you can rest now. Good night. Target duration, 40 minutes. Target WPM, 153 WPM. Required word count, approximately 6,000 word structure. Type single case deep dive. Chapter strategy, 10 chapters, density. Profile, high start to low end. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so let the sound of the rain carry you. Before you drift off, get comfortable, relax, and let us travel back to a time of dust and silence. Tonight, we look past the headlines and the Hollywood glamour. We look at the dust, the miles of empty highway, and the quiet moments that defined two lives before they became legends. The year is 1930. The place is West Dallas, an area known to the locals as the Devil's Back Porch. It is a world suspended in a haze of grit, where the air is thick enough to taste and the heat is a physical weight that presses down on the tin roofs of the shanty town. Here, the Great Depression is not a news headline. It is the very atmosphere in which people breathe. It is the smell of the nearby bog, a heavy, stagnant scent that clings to clothes and settles into the pores of the skin. It is the sound of dry boards expanding and contracting under the relentless Texas sun, a slow, rhythmic creaking that marks the passing of the hours. In this forgotten corner of the world, poverty was not a tragedy that struck suddenly. It was a slow, quiet state of being. It was the stillness of unemployed men sitting on overturned crates, their hands idle, their eyes fixed on the middle distance. There was no urgency here, only a vast, stretching weight. The campgrounds were a maze of makeshift shelters, tents and shacks patched together with scrap wood and flattened tin cans. At night, the only light came from kerosene lamps that flickered behind thin walls, casting long, dancing shadows against the dirt roads. We often imagine history as a series of loud events, of gunshots and sirens. But for the people living in the Devil's Back Porch, history was the sound of the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. It was the feeling of grit between the teeth and the sight of a sky that refused to rain. The humidity rose from the Trinity River, wrapping the camp in a damp embrace that made the nights sticky and sleepless. Children played in the dust with rusted cans, their voices muted by the heavy air. Women hung laundry on lines that sagged under the weight of wet cotton, the fabric stiffening as it dried in the dusty breeze. It was a world where the horizon was always gray, and the concept of tomorrow felt like a luxury few could afford. Survival was the only ambition. In this landscape of gray and brown, two figures were about to meet. They were not yet the outlaws the world would come to know. They were simply products of this environment, shaped by the lack of opportunity and the abundance of time. They were drifting, like the dust motes that floated in the shafts of sunlight piercing the gloom of the shacks. And like the dust, they were waiting for a wind strong enough to carry them away. The calendar on the wall read January 1930. The heat of the summer had finally broken, replaced by a winter chill that settled deep into the bones of West Dallas. It was a time of stillness. Inside the small frame house on Herbert Street, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the quiet anticipation of a life about to change. Clyde Barrow was sitting in the kitchen. He was a young man then, slight of build and soft-spoken, his presence unassuming in the dim light. If you looked at him closely, you would not see the hardened criminal of future headlines. You would see eyes that held a deep, resonant sadness, the kind that comes from staring too long at a gray horizon. His arm was broken, resting carefully in a sling, a physical fragility that made him seem more human than the legends would later suggest. Then there was Bonnie. She was small, with hair that seemed to catch the weak light filtering through the dusty window panes. She was not yet the outlaw Moll. She was a woman looking for a color other than the brown earth that coated every surface of her world. She was making hot chocolate. It was a domestic scene, almost boring in its simplicity. The steam rose from the ceramic cups, curling into the cool air of the kitchen, carrying with it the sweet, comforting smell of cocoa. They talked about nothing in particular. They spoke of the weather, the healing arm, and the mundane struggle of the day. The wallpaper in the room was peeling slightly at the corners, revealing the layers of history beneath, while dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that pierced the gloom. The floorboards creaked softly as they shifted their weight, a sound that felt loud in the intimacy of the moment. There was no premonition of the violence to come, no shadow of the end that awaited them on a Louisiana road. In that quiet kitchen, amidst the smell of chocolate and old timber, they were simply two lost souls recognizing a kindred spirit. They were two ships drifting in a dried-out sea, finding an anchor in one another. But the quiet of that meeting was fragile, and the law has a long memory. The memory of the law is not just long, it is patient. It waits in the blind spots of the rearview mirror and in the quiet pauses of a conversation. For Clyde, the silence of the kitchen was soon replaced by the deafening slam of a cell door. The charge was auto theft, a common enough sin in those desperate days, but the punishment would far outweigh the crime. He was sent to Eastham Prison Farm, a place that sat on the map like a bruise on the Texas landscape. We travel now to the fields of Eastham, where the humidity hangs in the air like a wet wool blanket. It was a world removed from the romance of the open road, defined instead by the brutal geometry of the cotton rows. The sun here was not a source of light, but a physical weight that pressed down on the backs of the men in white. It bleached the color from the earth and the hope from the soul. In the height of the Texas summer, the heat was a living thing. It rose from the soil in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon until the fences seemed to dance. The only sound was the rhythmic, dull thud of hooves hitting the dry earth and the endless, droning buzz of cicadas hidden in the pine trees. It was a hypnotic, oppressive sound, a lullaby of exhaustion that never ceased. The air smelled of sweat, turned earth, and the metallic tang of the nearby Trinity River, which offered no relief, only a humid breath that clung to the skin. Day after day, the routine was absolute. The men moved in unison, a long line of white figures against the brown dirt, swinging hooves with a cadence that marked the passing of time better than any clock. There was no tomorrow here. There was only the row in front of you, the salt stinging your eyes, and the watchful gaze of the guards on horseback, their shadows stretching long across the fields. To survive Eastham, one had to become part of this rhythm, to let the mind drift away while the body turned into a machine of labor. But the danger at Eastham did not only come from the sun or the guards. It lived in the shadows of the dormitory after the lights went out. Clyde, small and quiet, found himself the target of a fellow inmate, a man whose cruelty was as relentless as the heat. The abuse was a debt that accrued daily, a heavy ledger that Clyde carried in silence. It was a darkness that threatened to consume what little light he had left. Then came the moment when the ledger was balanced. It happened not with a shout, but with a sudden clinical finality. A weapon was found, a pipe was raised, and a life ended in the shadows of the dormitory. There was no chaotic struggle, no cinematic battle, just the dull sound of impact, and then a return to the heavy silence of the prison night. The cicadas continued their song outside, indifferent to the violence that had just transpired within the walls. The investigation that followed was murky, lost in the code of silence that governs such places. Another inmate serving a life sentence took the blame, shielding Clyde from the electric chair. But while Clyde escaped the legal consequence, he did not escape the psychological toll. Something inside him calcified under the Texas sun, turning from soft clay into brittle stone. He had entered Eastham as a thief, a boy looking for a joyride. He was forging himself into something else entirely, a man who knew that survival sometimes required the ultimate price. When the gates finally opened in February 1932, the wind felt different against his face. He walked out into the free world, but he did not walk out whole. The boy who had sipped cocoa in a sunlit kitchen was gone, left behind in the cotton rows. In his place stood a stranger, hardened by the kiln of Eastham, ready to reclaim the time that had been stolen from him. The reunion in West Dallas was not marked by fanfare or the loud celebrations that often accompany a homecoming. It was a quiet affair, unfolding in the shadows of the porch, where the dust still swirled in the same patterns it had 2 years prior. When Bonnie Parker looked into the eyes of the man who had returned from Eastham, she did not see the boy she had made hot chocolate for. That boy had been left behind in the humid dormitories of the prison farm. In his place stood a man who moved with a new, jagged caution, his eyes scanning the horizon even when he was sitting still. They did not speak of the things that had happened in the dark. There are some truths that are too heavy to carry in conversation, so they are simply carried in the silence between words. Bonnie, with her poet's heart, understood that the soft clay of Clyde Barrow had hardened into stone, and yet she did not turn away. Instead, She anchored herself to him in the gray reality of 1932, where the Depression had drained the color from the world. Clyde was the only thing that felt vivid, even if that vividness was dangerous. They made a pact, not in writing, but in the way they sat together on the steps, that they would not just survive the gray, they would outrun it. To outrun the world, they needed a vessel. And this is where the third character in their story enters the narrative. Not a person, but a machine, the Ford V8. In the mythology of the Barrow Gang, the car is often just a getaway vehicle, a tool for escape. But to Bonnie and Clyde, it was much more than that. It was their home. It was their fortress. It was the only place where the laws of Texas could not touch them, as long as the engine was running. The 1934 Ford V8 was a marvel of its time, a beast of steel and chrome that hummed with a power that felt almost alive. Imagine, if you will, the sensory experience of sitting inside that cabin as the sun began to set over the Oklahoma plains. The interior smelled of a specific grounding mixture, the sharp chemical tang of gasoline, the earthy scent of stale tobacco smoke, and the cold, stiff aroma of worn leather seats. It was a smell that meant safety to them. The dashboard was simple, utilitarian, but to Clyde, it was the control panel of his freedom. When the key turned in the ignition, the car didn't just start, it woke up. The V8 engine possessed a deep, rhythmic growl, a low-frequency vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and settled into the bones of the passengers. It was a lullaby of combustion. For hours on end, that vibration was the only constant in their lives. It was a heartbeat that never skipped, a steady, mechanical reassurance that they were moving, that they were leaving the past in the rearview mirror at 80 miles an hour. The road in 1932 was not the interstate system we know today. There were no bright overhead lights to guide the way, no endless chains of illuminated rest stops. To drive at night was to navigate a profound and absolute darkness. The headlights of the Ford cut two narrow cones of yellow light into the void, revealing only the next 100 feet of gravel and asphalt. Beyond that light, the world simply ceased to exist. They drove for the sake of driving. The crimes, the robberies of small grocery stores and gas stations, were almost incidental, mere necessities to fuel the tank and keep the wheels turning. The act of movement became their primary state of being. They crossed state lines not as conquerors, but as ghosts, slipping from Texas into Oklahoma, from Oklahoma into Missouri, drifting wherever the back roads took them. Inside the car, a domestic routine emerged. It was a strange, cramped housekeeping. Bonnie would organize their few belongings in the back seat. A saxophone case, a stack of magazines, a change of clothes. They ate cold sandwiches while the landscape blurred past the windows, a smear of green and brown. They took turns sleeping in the passenger seat, lulled by the motion of the car and the hypnotic hum of the tires on the pavement. It was a life of pain-enforced naps, snatching moments of rest whenever the adrenaline faded enough to let their heavy eyes close. For the listener joining us tonight, perhaps you know that feeling, the need to find a small pocket of comfort in a world that feels uncomfortable. For Bonnie and Clyde, the Ford V8 was that pocket. It was a capsule of privacy where the insomnia club of two could exist without judgment. But the road, for all its promise of freedom, was also a trap. It was a loop that never truly went anywhere. They were running, yes, but they were running in circles. The geography of their lives became a blur of similar-looking towns, identical wooden porches, and the same dusty fields stretching out to the horizon. The monotony of the road began to seep into their souls, matching the monotony of the poverty they had tried to escape. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from driving through the American Midwest in the middle of the night. You pass farmhouse windows glowing with warm orange light, and you know that inside there are families sitting down to dinner, people who belong to a place. Clyde would watch those lights flicker past, his hands gripping the steering wheel, knowing that he could never stop, never knock on the door, never belong. He had traded the cage of Eastham for the cage of the car. The bars were gone, replaced by the horizon, but the confinement was just as real. As the miles accumulated, so did the legend. But the legend was a story being written by newspapers and breathless reporters, a fiction that had little to do with the tired, dusty reality of two young people sleeping in their clothes on a roadside in Louisiana. The public saw the glamour. They didn't see the exhaustion. They didn't smell the gasoline or feel the damp chill of a dawn spent shivering in a parked car. One night, somewhere near the Missouri border, they pulled the car off the main road and into a grove of trees to rest. The engine ticked as it cooled, the metal contracting in the night air. The silence of the woods rushed in to fill the space left by the motor. It was a heavy, thick silence, broken only by the sound of crickets and the wind moving through the leaves. In that quiet, Bonnie looked at the map spread out on her lap, tracing the lines of the highways they had traveled. They were lines that led everywhere and nowhere. If you are still awake with me, take a moment to adjust your pillow. Let the image of that dark, quiet grove settle in your mind. The car is parked. The engine is off. The world is still. There is no pursuit here, only the pause between breaths. It was in these quiet moments that the weight of their choices settled upon them. They were together, yes, but they were alone in the vastness of the country. The V8 engine was their heart, and the road was their bloodstream. But they were slowly bleeding out. They just didn't know it yet. Or perhaps, looking at the hardened set of Clyde's jaw in the moonlight, perhaps they did. The car would carry them further than they ever expected, into the pages of history and into the crosshairs of the law. But for now, in the spring of 1932, it simply carried them through the night. The wheels turned, the gravel crunched, and the headlights pushed back the dark 1 mile at a time. They were moving fast, fueled by fear and love and gasoline, unaware that the road they were traveling was slowly narrowing, guiding them toward a destination that had been waiting for them since the moment they first met. As they crossed the border into Missouri, leaving the dust of Texas behind for a brief moment, the illusion of freedom was at its peak. The engine roared, a mechanical defiant shout against the silence of the plains. They were the kings and queens of the asphalt, ruling over a kingdom of empty highways and starlit fields. But every king must eventually fall, and every road must eventually end. The camera was waiting in Joplin, ready to capture the image that would freeze them in time, transforming them from desperate fugitives into immortal icons. But that is a development that lay waiting in the future, just around the next bend in the road. For now, let us leave them in the car, suspended in that space between the past they were running from and the future they could not avoid. The hum of the V8 is a steady drone, a white noise that drowns out the world. Let it drown out the waking world for you, too. The road is long, and the night is quiet. We travel on. Freedom, for Clyde Barrow, did not smell like the fresh air of the Texas plains. It smelled of gasoline, hot oil, and the sharp tang of burnt rubber. When the heavy gates of Eastham Prison Farm finally opened in February of 1932, the reunion with Bonnie Parker was not a question of if, but when. It was a magnetic pull, a gravity that neither had the power to resist. They found each other in the gray light of winter, two fractured souls seeking a wholeness that only the other could provide. And almost immediately, they made the decision that would define the rest of their short lives. They would not stay still. To stop was to die. To keep moving was to live. At the center of this new life was a third character, one as vital to their legend as the fedoras and the cigars. It was the Ford 5.8. In the early 1930s, this machine was a marvel of engineering, a steel beast capable of outrunning almost anything the local law enforcement could put on the road. But for Bonnie and Clyde, it was more than a getaway vehicle. It was their living room, their bedroom, and their fortress. Imagine the interior of that car as they crossed the state lines under the cover of darkness. The seats were stiff leather, cool to the touch in the evenings and sticky in the humid southern afternoons. The air inside was a permanent haze of cigarette smoke and the faint, sweet scent of Bonnie's perfume, mixing with the mechanical odor of the engine. The vibration of the V8 was a constant companion, a rhythmic humming that traveled up through the floorboards and settled into their bones. It was a lullaby of horsepower, promising that as long as the engine was running, they were safe. The driving was endless. In 1932, the interstate highway system was a dream of the future. The roads they traveled were narrow ribbons of gravel and dirt, winding through the pitch-black countryside. There were no streetlights to guide them, only the twin beams of the Ford's headlights cutting a cone of visibility through the heavy, suffocating darkness. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires became the soundtrack of their existence. They drove through the rain that turned the dirt to slick mud. They drove through the dust storms that turned the day into twilight. They drove until their eyes burned and their bodies ached, fueled by adrenaline and the fear of what lay behind them. The road became their home, a moving strip of asphalt that promised freedom as long as the wheels kept turning. They ate cold beans from cans while the car idled on forgotten side roads. They took turns sleeping in the cramped back seat, knees pulled to chests, while the other kept watch over the silent fields. It was a life of motion, a shark-like existence where stillness was the enemy. They were moving fast, faster than the local sheriffs could track, faster than the telegrams could fly. But they were moving fast, and the world was watching.